say tea, but he apparently had coffee, um, which I didn't know was legal in London. But um, over to you, Anthony.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you. If you don't mind, I'll just present my screen, and I'll do the introductions as part of the session. It's actually feedback that I've received historically from when I first started doing these types of things years ago. Was I didn't really introduce myself, who I was, what my background was. So I will cover that a little bit. I won't bore you too much, but I think it might help just to understand me. So let me just try and share my screen. Hopefully I'm sharing the right one. I'm doing this on my laptop screen because I use a ultra wide and doesn't always present well. So please let me know if you can see this okay. Yeah.
Looks good on my screen.
Okay, awesome. So welcome everybody. The talk I'm going to deliver this evening is on an Azure storage service called Azure NetApp Files. I've entitled it Azure Storage Has Never Been So Cool. And some of you might be thinking, oh my God, this is a storage guide trying to tell us that storage is cool. But hopefully you'll see that it does have some cool aspects, and hopefully the pun will resonate as we go through this. So firstly, I'm just going to just do a quick intro to myself and who I am. So my name is Anthony Mashford. I'm a cloud solution architect, and I work in the NetApp Azure Business Group. Even though NetApp is traditionally what's seen as a storage company, 80% of the products now are extremely cloud focused. And as you'll go on to see, the Azure NetApp Files product is underpinned with the technology that NetApp has been developing for well over 30 years. Myself, I've worked in the IT industry for over 20 years. My background is primarily data centers. And my journey in Azure started around about 2012, when Azure was kind of in its infancy. And I've been full-time with the Azure ecosystem since 2014. And as I said at the beginning, one of the criticisms I received was I didn't explain who I was and my background. So that's my technical background. However, my first career was actually working on fishing boats. Excuse me. I was a fisherman, and I enjoyed it. It was great in the summer months. And then when the winter months come, I kind of got tired of getting up early and getting cold and wet. So I decided to change my career, and I ended up joining the military. And I was part of what was then now His Majesty's Royal Marines. And I spent 10 years as a Royal Marine doing various things, mostly enjoying myself. But then I had a young family that came along, and I needed to change tack. Just in case you're interested, that's actually me there in the picture. And then I decided to leave and seek a new career, and I was not quite sure what to do. I touched a bit of technology in the military, not to a great level, but a reasonable amount back then. So I opted to start technology, and this is now my third career. So for the last over 20 years now, I've been in this world. I'm an infrastructure guy, from background. Started my career in VMS and Unix. Transitioned to, as my former colleagues used to say, the dark side, to work with the Microsoft ecosystem probably since 2003, and I've really been there ever since. In my spare time, I'm also a motorcyclist. I like getting out on my motorbike, riding on the roads. I also do a bit of track riding, having fun. So that's kind of how I relax myself and decompress, let's say. So by the way, please do feel free to ask questions. I'll try to monitor the Teams window, see if anybody's putting hands up, but I'm very happy to field any questions as they come. So today's agenda, we're just going to talk about some challenges that have over the years been difficult to address with Azure, and that will get onto the...
They get their supply in.
Sorry, was that a question? Oh, no. So yeah, some of the challenges that have been experienced by customers trying to deliver certain workloads into Azure, and as to why Azure NetApp Files was spawned to address those. I'm going to give you an overview of the Azure NetApp Files product as a very brief overview, and then talk about some of the features, some of the new features and enhancements that Microsoft have brought to the platform in the last year. And then I'm going to hopefully be able to do you a demo. What I've also done is I've created some Terraform code, which is in my GitHub repo, which I will share with you guys as part of this. So if after this you would like to go and play with it, there's some Terraform code which will get a reasonably feature-rich lab spun up probably within 15 to 20 minutes for you, where you'll have virtual machines and key vault and networking infrastructure and the Azure NetApp files volumes to actually test and play with. So I'll be very happy to share that. So the challenges, I think the first one, cost. I mean, hey, who isn't cost conscious nowadays? Because as we're always told, cloud is not cheap, right? But it is still huge. And for me, in my normal daily working life, the conversations around optimization of cost optimization is pretty common. But I always remind customers, a natural byproduct of performance optimization, making sure you're right sizing for the environment to deliver, the performance and availability. The natural byproduct is cost optimization. So that's one thing. And hopefully part of this you'll see where the Azure NetApp file service is actually helping customers save money. And I can share a few stories for customers that have realized considerable savings. And one of those actually was a 7-digit number they actually saved. So a real amount by utilizing Azure NetApp files and adopting a cloud mindset about how you do this. Test and dev environments can be difficult to replicate. So if you wanted to test on specific data sets that maybe were productionized and you wanted to then anonymize them for testing purposes, to actually replicate or get a copy of that can be challenging. But Azure NetApp files has some nice tricks, which is NetApp sort of specific, but it's been brought into the Azure ecosystem to help you do this. And then migration of those large data sets, customers that are looking to exit data centers, and move into Azure can be cumbersome. But the ANF service has various features to do that, and scale. And I think this is where Azure NetApp files can really add value, as the ability to flex and scale on demand, unlike any other service. So the challenge is really around things like compute, network, memory, and disk capacity. It can affect the following: the performance and the scalability and cost, and also licensing. So what I'll show you is an example later on where, by essentially decoupling the storage from the virtual machines, can massively help to reduce the size of those machines. So those who are familiar with Azure and the constructs of Azure and how the different SKUs are available, the capabilities of those SKUs. For instance, if you wanted to drive higher throughput, higher IOPS, then you are probably most likely going to need larger virtual machines. And those larger virtual machines will have more CPU count, and more CPU count, for instance, for solutions such as Oracle or SQL, can also drive up the licensing count and the cost. So being able to decouple the storage and offload that off processing to Azure NetApp files can then reduce the machine sizes and the machine SKUs. And some of the organizations I've been working with, one of them, we were working with a very large insurance firm. Their projected scale for what they needed for processing and performance was they were topping out at around about 108 vCPUs. By offloading onto INF, they've actually managed to reduce the vCPU count to as low as 16 cores, because the storage is doing all the number crunching in the background, without obviously reducing the load on the machines. So I'll have a quick overview now of what Azure NetApp files is. I think this statement is very, very important. Okay, so Microsoft Azure NetApp files is a Microsoft Azure first-party service delivered, supported, and built by Microsoft. This sometimes can be confusing because Azure has a marketplace where vendors can advertise their solutions, and then customers can draw down on those via the Azure marketplace. My company, NetApp, has a marketplace offering and a technology called Cloud Volumes ONTAP, which is a virtualized version of the ONTAP operating system that runs on Azure. It runs on infrastructure, so virtual machines, managed disks, storage accounts, etc. But Azure NetApp files is a platform service delivered, supported, built by Microsoft. It's not a third-party service, so it comes directly out of your consumption plan. You don't need to put any licensing, you don't need to put any tin, you simply consume the storage on demand when you need it. So that's really key to point out. And this service has been around for almost 5.5 years now. So Azure NetApp Files went generally available in May 2019. It's a very, very established service. It's still one of the quickest storage service growth services in Azure for Microsoft, and it's becoming extremely popular around the globe. Of the 66 regions, I think now Azure has globally, Azure NetApp Files is in 46 of those regions. So it's brought based on demand, but I'd imagine most of the regions that you guys are working with, the ANF service will be available. So we'll just talk quickly about the workloads, the strategic workloads where Azure NetApp Files adds value. There are many others, but there's these 5, and the bottom 2 you'll see here, the unstructured file data, 6 workloads where Azure NetApp Files really can add value. So SAP being probably one of the largest. Anybody's familiar with SAP, very highly strung, very latency sensitive. At one point, Azure NetApp Files was the only storage service in Azure certified to host SAP S/4HANA databases. So HPC, and I've included AI here because, hey, who's not talking about AI at the minute? The Azure NetApp File service is great for high-performance compute workloads because of the ability to flex and burst and scale on demand when needed. And you'll go on to see some of the metrics around how far this can scale at some point. The AI piece is kind of in its infancy, I would say, really still. But the Azure NetApp File service can be used, and it was announced 2 weeks ago at the Insight conference that there is a custom connector for Microsoft 365 Copilot to target the Azure NetApp File storage for model training, resource augmented generation, etc. And I've seen it in action. It's pretty impressive, to be fair. And it's a custom connector that NetApp has developed for Copilot. It's still to be sort of released into GA, but it is now publicly available to look at. The other one, so the next one is VDI, so Azure Virtual Desktop. Very, very popular, probably one of the most popular services that I get involved with during my day-to-day work. Massively helps to drive down, login times, the ability to flex and scale to meet I/O demand during login storms. Very consistent user experience, very simple integration into Active Directory, and the storage, unlike other Azure Files offerings, doesn't suffer for things like open file handles, so maximum number of open files. The next one, the databases, so Oracle SQL. This is back to what I was saying around decoupling the storage from the virtual machines. One of the customers I was working with, managed to massively drive down their SQL licensing count because they managed to lower the vCPU count. And by decoupling the storage, you can flex and scale the storage again on demand when you need it. So to meet those, high performance peaks during, for instance, the working month, take payroll as an example. When the payroll is going to happen, when that's going to run. So you can scale the storage service up to deliver super high throughput and I/O during that period, and then scale it back down again after it's completed the run. And again, this is cloud economics, right? So the more you can right size for performance, the better cost optimization you're going to achieve. And the one at the end, AVS, so Azure VMware Solution. Since the Broadcom acquisition, it's been a huge topic of conversation. Being able to decouple the storage from the AVS nodes is important because a majority of people I work with have very storage heavy environments. And AVS is essentially HCI. It's hyper-converged infrastructure, which is CPU, RAM, storage in a box. If you need more of anything, you need more boxes. So by being able to offload the storage to Azure NetApp Files NFS data stores, customers can lower the node count. One of the organizations I work with recently, their projected sizing for AVS based on storage was 19 nodes. However, by offloading some of that storage, because AVS has inbuilt storage capability with vSAN, but once the vSAN was at the limit which it reaches its capacity, you can offload storage to ANF, and they actually dropped that 19 node count down to 9, so they saved 10 nodes, and these nodes aren't cheap, they're quite expensive. So those are the 5 main areas where ANF really does add value and help improve performance and also help with cost optimization. There are many others, but the sixth one we'll talk about is just the unstructured file data. The stuff that just needs to be there, but probably doesn't get touched that often. Now, until recently, ANF or Azure NetApp files wouldn't have probably been a good use for this solution for that use case, because ANF is seen as an expensive service, an expensive storage service. But when you look at it in the wider round, if you look at the TCO in the whole, if you think about it, it's a service delivered by Microsoft, which they manage for you. You simply consume it as you need it. You don't need to feed, water, monitor, manage, and maintain it. All that sort of stuff starts to add up, and because you can flex it up and down as you need, there are some little caveats. We'll discuss with those in a bit. But you can get clever about this. And there are some announcements which we will talk about, and one of them is cool access, and I'll cover that in a bit. The cool access tiering is the ability to tier data out of the volume to ZRS storage. It's based on lifecycle. And the savings can be considerable. And if you look at the price point, it's bringing the Azure NetApp Files standard service tier, we'll talk about the service levels in a bit, down to around about Azure Files hot tier, but still maintaining all the goodness, all the enterprise grade storage management capability that NetApp has as part of the Azure NetApp File service. Any questions so far? Hopefully people haven't fallen asleep yet. Cool. So I mentioned service levels. There are 3: standard, premium, and ultra, and you get various throughput at the different levels, starting at 16 megabytes of throughput per terabyte, right up to the ultra tier. We can get 128 megabytes of throughput per terabyte. ANF offers the widest choice of file protocols, NFS and SMB, and indeed dual protocol volumes. So I have organizations I've worked with that have Linux backends writing to file shares being accessed by Windows front-end clients. So that dual protocol capability is a USP for Azure as a storage platform. It offers a 99.99 SLA. It's a highly available platform. What I will point out, it's not a zone-aware platform, so it doesn't have ZRS capability, but the architecture, there are ways to architect zonal capabilities and failovers, but it's not a zonal aware service. It's bringing that on-premises class performance that NetApp has had historically. For 30 plus years, NetApp has been the market leader in file storage, and it's delivered using the 3 service levels. And it's an Azure consistent experience, as I mentioned at the beginning. It's supported, delivered, and built by Microsoft. It's not a marketplace option, and it's underpinned with all the ONTAP capability, which is the essentially NetApp operating system, where you get all the goodness of things like cloning, snapshots, backup, replication, etc. So regarding the storage hierarchy, hopefully everybody's familiar with what an Azure subscription is. So within your Azure subscription, you create your Azure NetApp Files accounts. So these are where you choose to base your storage geographically, and you can have up to 10 accounts per subscription. Within your subscriptions, you create your capacity pools. Imagine these for people familiar with storage constructs as an aggregate. The capacity pools are important for 2 reasons. They're where you set your performance tier, standard, and premium, and ultra, based on what throughput you need, but it's also where the billing starts. So as soon as you create a capacity pool, you will be billed based on the capacity utilized on an hourly basis. And a capacity pool can be as small as 1 terabyte and as large as 2 petabytes. So ultimately, there's quite a bit of capacity you can realize within those pools. Then within your capacity pools, you create your volumes. Volumes can be NFS volumes, they can be SMB, CIFS volumes, or they can indeed, as I mentioned, be dual protocol volumes. The smallest volume size currently is 50 gig, and the largest volume size is 100 terabytes. However, Microsoft have introduced recently, and it went GA about a month or 2 ago, the ability to leverage what's called large volumes, where you can scale those volumes now up to 2 petabytes in size. Okay. The performance and the sizing. So when Azure NetApp Files was first released, it utilized a method called AutoQoS, where the size of the volume dictated the performance. And in this example here, there's a 10 terabyte volume at the premium service tier where you get 64 megabytes a second of throughput per terabyte. So ultimately, you've got 640 megabytes of that. That volume will use. That's the scale: 10 terabytes, 10 times 64, 640 megabytes. Now the auto QS feature was fine, but it was kind of limited a bit. Customers sometimes might need to over provision storage to get the throughput performance they needed. So they didn't necessarily need capacity, but they needed performance, so they have to over provision. And this is an example of that. So you see a 4 terabyte volume. This is the ultra service tier. So 128 megabits per terabyte, 4 terabyte volume, 4 times 128, 512 megas in the data volume. And then you can see the backup volume, 4.5, has got slightly more. However, Microsoft decided to adjust the service, I think it was in June 2021, and introduce manual QoS. So now you can independently assign the throughput to a volume over its size. So it's much more granular. It's based on the throughput available in the capacity pool, but you can carve that up. And as you see here, the data volume, where you probably need more throughput, has 704 megabytes per second of throughput, but the backup volume, where you probably need less, only has 256 megabytes of throughput. So you can get a bit more flexible with this, and hopefully, this method it's still valid today. The majority of customers choose manual over auto QoS. There are some reasons why you would want to use auto, but the majority of customers would use manual. Another method which we have designed and implemented is what's called dynamic volume shaping. So dynamic volume shaping is flexing the volumes to meet the performance of the workload at the time it's required. And in the example here, you'll see the green line at the top is the provision storage, but the blue line underneath is fluctuating throughout the working day. This is the workload. Now, dynamic volume shaping, by moving size and throughput the volumes to meet the performance and provision storage accordingly, can massively impact the cost and drive down and save expenditure. So this is utilizing, environments such as VDI, where you do get those login storms in the morning when everybody comes in at, say, I don't know, between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. Everybody's logging in, a bit more demand on the platform. Then the platform ends up in a steady state while people working throughout the day, and there might be small spikes at the end of the working day. But you can flex the storage to give the throughput needed when you need it.
Anthony,
yeah.
Can I drop a question on you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. We have, so you shared some of the IOPS and the throughput numbers, and I'm curious if you can compare that, like ratio-wise or with absolute numbers, to what you might expect in other kinds of workloads. Like, I'm just trying to figure out what to compare it to. Like, if I'm in like premium tier and I have 4,000, what compared to what? Like, could you have any sort of comparison to kind of?
Yeah. So, so let's start with the standard tier. So with a standard tier, the workloads that will probably be positioned or work quite well on there, maybe some sort of web app content which needs to be served, unstructured user data, things like departmental shares, home folders. Now, it's interesting. If you look at the Microsoft documentation and architecture for, say, a VDI workload, it says there, where possible, use premium storage. Okay. Now, in Azure, you have Azure Files premium storage, and you have Azure NetApp Files premium storage. They have the name premium, but they're not comparable apples with apples. So a lot of customers that I've worked with who deploy VDI workloads can function quite happily on Azure NetApp Files standard storage, because it can deliver the demand, throughput, performance, and IOP requirement that's needed. And it's much cheaper than Azure Files Premium. Yeah. So if premium in the name, but they're not like for like. If you look at it in a pecking order, you'd have, say, price-wise, you'd have Azure NetApp Files Standard, Azure Files Premium, Azure NetApp Files Premium. So for that workload, for VDI, I'd imagine customers would be using either Azure Files Premium or Azure NetApp Files. And it does depend, right? I've worked with an organization which are traders, and if you're familiar with trading platforms and the T's and C's around performance, super low, low latency. They this customer I work with, they actually they deployed the trading platform on ANF Ultra tier because they needed super performance, but they didn't need capacity. So they could, to get the performance of the standard tier, they would have like close to 100 terabytes of storage. They got the performance out of 8 terabytes of Ultra. So it really does. There are some tools. So what I will towards the end, there are some calculators, some TCO tools, some sizing tools to assist you with those decisions around things like AVS, like Azure VMware Solution, SAP. There is just a general sizing tool as well, where you can go in and say, well, if I had 50 terabytes of storage at the premium tier, how much throughput would I get? You know, whether I was using 4K, 8K, 64K block sizes as well, because workloads like have different block sizes. Majority like SQL, you would probably find as a 64K block size. AVS could be either 8 or 64K. By default, ONTAP or the waffle system uses 4K, but obviously the workload could dictate the block size. So there are tools to do that. So we can hopefully that's answered your question.
Yeah, those comparisons are really helpful. It helps put it in perspective. Thank you. And the decoupling of the workload from the data requirements, so you have more flexibility to scale those independently. That seems like a pretty important point. And the last slide that you mentioned, I think before I popped the question in about having your workload dynamically adjust to your active needs, that sounds like a very cloudy, very cloud friendly way to provide capacity. And I'm guessing that that's not really something you can do in Azure with other storage solutions.
Well, I suppose you can, but I think a good example of this, and I'm gonna use Azure Files a lot because essentially they are kind of comparable, options within Azure for delivering file services. So take an Azure Files file share, you can scale that up to a point, but you have to wait 24 hours before you can scale it back down again. With Azure NetApp Files in the same service tier, you can grow your capacity pools, you can grow or shrink your capacity pools and volumes on demand when you need. What you can also do is you can take a volume from a standard pool and put it into an ultra pool. The only caveat there, Microsoft have actually adjusted this last Friday. It was a 7-day cooling off period before you could move it to a lower pool. It's now a 24-hour period. So actually you can get, there's a huge cost saving. And we do have customers who use that to good effect to help save their money. In a DR scenario, we'll go on in a minute to talk about the replication. You can replicate data across regions or across zones using the inbuilt replication technology that NetApp has called SnapMirror. You can replicate. So, for instance, if you're running your production system on, say, premium, you can replicate to standard. You don't have to replicate to premium. And then, God forbid, you invoke DR. You can then move that volume to a higher service level. So again, it's cloud economics, right? I try to work with the customers I work with and really get them to do a huge amount of due diligence on the actual requirements of their workload and what they need performance-wise, because then we can make sure that we are trying to give them the best possible experience to make sure they have a solution which is well architected, delivers the value to the business, can scale when needed, but most importantly is being optimized for cost as well. So yeah.
That's super helpful. Thank you, Anthony.
You're welcome. So I'm going to go now and just talk about a few Azure NetApp Files features. There are many, but I'm just going to highlight a few and some of the much more important. I've just mentioned actually replication. So Azure NetApp Files has cross-region replication. So this is basically the ability to replicate a volume from one region to another. And Azure has the paired region construct. There are also non-regional pairs as well. But ANF is currently still tied to those regional pairing constructs for both regional and non-regional pairs. But it is what it is. That's the only option you have. And I'll use the UK as an example. So in the UK, we have UK South and we have UK West. So you can replicate, you can create a volume in UK South, and then you can create a replica volume in UK West. And then you can set the replication intervals to be 10 minutes, 1 hour, or 1 day. It's an asynchronous replication. But ultimately, your lowest RPO is going to be up to 20 minutes at the lowest synchronization interval. But the really cool thing about this, it happens at the storage layer. It doesn't replicate, even though we're talking about network attached storage, It doesn't replicate across the network, so you haven't got to factor in things like bandwidth charges because you are replicating cross region. There is a replication charge, but it's nowhere near as expensive as the network replication. Because it's at block level, it's very, very efficient. It's not file level, so it doesn't take the whole file. It simply does it at the block level. So very efficient way to do this. Also, what you have the ability to do, I did mention that Azure NetApp Files is not a zonal aware service. So it's not like, like Azure Files where you have the ZRS option. Azure NetApp Files doesn't have that option. Oh, by the way, I just realized that my slide's incorrect. It's no longer in public preview. It's been generally available, so ignore that. So with the zonal placement, you can choose, where available, because, not all Azure regions have availability zones. You can choose which zone to place your volume into. In this case, you have AZ1 and AZ2. There's no transfer charges between zones, so you haven't got to factor any of that in. So it can be quite efficient. And as I said, you can have a primary volume, a production volume running on premium, and you can have your secondary, your DR volume running, say, on the standard tier. And this, I think, is, this is sometimes customers say, oh, well, we want it to be seamless replication across. Well, that's fine. But this is where you can leverage, things like application redundancy, SQL always on availability groups. In VDI world, you have the option to use things like Cloud Cache for FS Logics, but I'll be honest, not a fan of it. Or you can have things like Oracle Data Guard. And ultimately, it's that shared responsibility model, right? And I think those of us who've worked in Azure and talked to customers about Azure historically, I remember talking at a conference many, many years ago, I think around about 2015. And someone in the audience said, well, I don't want to have multiple machines. I just want to use a single virtual machine because, hey, Microsoft makes it super redundant and available for us, right? And I'm like, yeah, but you've got one machine. How do you patch it? How do you update it, right? So this shared responsibility model about how you architect your, Microsoft deliver the platform, they give you the SLAs, but how you then architect your solutions on top of Azure, that's that shared responsibility piece. But ultimately, you can deliver resiliency and high availability and resiliency, two things really, but you can deliver high availability for the solution and you can make it resilient by using either zonal or regional replication. And going on from the zonal placement, there's also cross-zone replication. So like cross-region replication, where you can replicate a volume between regions, you can use cross-zone replication should you wish as well. Some customers opt for application redundancy, as I said, things like SQL Always On, or you can use cross-zone replication, which functions exactly the same as cross-region replication to replicate your volume to a replica volume in a different zone. One other cool thing which Microsoft introduced a while ago is ANF Backup. It's a fully managed backup solution. It's not part of the Azure Backup Center. It's available within the Azure NetApp Files blade, and I'll go on to show you this in a bit. It's free to use. You don't need to pay to use the backup product. You pay for the storage that the backup consumes, but you don't need to pay a license to use the product. And what this does, it comes along once a day, it hoovers up the snapshots and it drops them into ZRS storage. So it takes them off of the ANF media and then drops them onto blob storage. Now, granted, this isn't an enterprise backup application solution, right? It's for some customers, it's good enough. For some, it's not. So some customers will probably use things like Commvault or Veeam or something, or Rubrik. But the ANF backup is, can deliver, I have one couple of customers, one specifically, who's using this to very good effect, where the type of data they hosted or the type of data being created was quite heavyweight, and the snapshots weren't as efficient as they normally are. Normally, snapshots have an overhead because the snapshots live in the volume of about 5, 10, maybe 15%. But this particular customer, the overhead of the snapshots, they were around about 30% heavy, which was driving up the size of the volume, which was driving up the cost. But they use ANF backup to offload the snapshots into the backup vault, and that way they can manage the volume size to be smaller, but still meet the RTO and RPO of the business to actually, should they ever need to recover. When I mentioned ANF data stores, for the last year or so, since the Broadcom acquisition of VMware, has been very, very popular. I work with one customer in the United Kingdom, a utilities company. They went from proof of concept to production in 6 weeks. migrated out of a data center onto AVS, because this is lift and shift, right? We lifted out of its ability to lift and shift is quicker than you would normally do, because you can leverage things like VMware's vMotion or HCX to actually migrate the applications. Now, when I first heard about AVS or Azure VMware Services, I was like, why would you want to take a hypervisor, then put it on a cloud, another hypervisor, and do all that? But for some customers, they have the challenge that maybe through contractual reasons they need to exit a data center, or they haven't got time to modernize the solutions to make them cloud native. To get them into Azure quickly, but still maintain the same methods for managing them, this is a really good solution. So, an ANF, as I said, creating the Azure NetApp Files NFS data stores to offload some of the storage heavy stuff onto ANF and then reduce that node count can be quite compelling. And I have quite a few examples where I've been working with clients that have saved considerable amount of money by introducing Azure NetApp Files into their environment to support the data stores. Another one I mentioned was Cool Access. So this recently went generally available. It's been in public preview for a while, but it's completely available across all service tiers. So they are both on the standard, the premium, and the ultra service tier. The great thing about this is it's transparent to the application or the end user, because the metadata still lives in the volume, but the cool data, the blocks, this is block level again, is moved into essentially cool access tier, which is ZRS storage. You can set the coolness period to be from 2 to 183 days. Once the data reaches that age, it's moved to the lowest storage tier. You can set the retrieval policies about how the data is warmed and how it's brought back. There's the default policy, there's on read, etc. But like I said, the metadata still lives in the volume. So the end user still sees their data. It's just residing in a much cheaper storage tier. I've put at the bottom there huge cost savings. I've seen savings in the region of 40 to 50%, which is quite compelling. Now, it does depend on how cool the data is. There's a retrieval. Obviously, if the data is retrieved from the cool access tier, seamless to end users. Somebody working on, say, a spreadsheet, 40, 50, 60 meg spreadsheet, where it might have taken a second or two to open, it might take 3 or 4 seconds to open. I suggest here for lower IO workloads, but there's nothing to stop any sort of proof of concept on the higher IO workloads to see how they perform. Some organizations, for instance, they write data to a database and they know after 2 weeks it's never going to be touched again. It just needs to be there for historical purposes. So maybe implementing a cool tiering period of, say, 45 days. So, once it gets to that period, it's probably not going to be needed. It gets moved to the ZRS tier, to the cool access tier, and then it might get called back by, maybe once or twice a year. So really cool service. And that's where my Azure storage has never been so cool, because this is quite a new feature, which has recently become generally available, and is massively helping to drive down expenditure. Some other features that have more recently been released. The dynamic service level change I mentioned earlier was 7 days. It's now been dropped to 24 hours. So if you wanted to move a volume, say from standard to ultra tier, and then you do what you need with it, you only have to wait now 24 hours before you can drop it back. Standard network features has been around for a while, but there's been various improvements on that. The standard network features is actually off the back of Microsoft upgrading the Azure networking stack, which then enabled Azure NetApp Files to utilize things like global peering, user-defined routes, network security groups, which it couldn't do before. So that was quite a cool feature, which again just gave ANF a bit more flexibility. Support for Azure Virtual WAN has also been brought to the service. So Azure Virtual WAN supports ANF. Things like double encryption. So double encryption arrests for financial organizations which have very stringent policies around security. So you get software encryption and hardware encryption. The thing to note with that feature is it does come a bit of a premium, so it's slightly more expensive than standard encryption. Non-browsable shares and access-based enumeration. So access-based enumeration, basically if a client's looking at a folder, if they don't have permissions to the files or folders, they don't see them, right? So they're hidden. They only see the objects if they have permissions on the object. Non-browsable shares, imagine this like a dollar share on a UNC path. Essentially, it's not advertised on the network, so to actually connect to the share itself, you'd have to know the UNC path. User quotas are now available, so you can apply a default and an individual quota to the volume of how much storage users can consume. Customer managed keys, customers keys using Azure Key Vault, so you can offload the key management to Azure Key Vault, bring your own key method. So again, certain organizations have compliance or governance requirements where they need to use their own encryption keys. And one which was announced a couple of weeks ago, reserve capacity. So like Azure reservations, reserved instances, you have the ability to pre-purchase 1 or 3 year options, storage, obviously at a discounted rate. So there's a few more updates which have been brought to the platform. I mentioned tools. So the product team that run ANF have created this little site, so aka.ms/ANF tools. There's things like performance calculators. So Bill, I mentioned earlier, different sizing tools. So in here, there's a sizing tool for sizing estimator for Azure VMware solution. And the cool thing about this is if you're working with an on-premises environment, if you can get an RV tools export of that vCenter implementation, you can then import that export into the tool, and it will show you the various sizings of, Azure NetApp Files is not a silver bullet, right? It's not a fixed all. It's never going to save the world, but it does add value. And this tool's give you the ability to realize where it will add value soon. If it doesn't, it will call that out as well. There's also a sizing tool for SAP, which is complex, agreed, but anybody who knows SAP will probably be able to utilize that and get a good indication where ANF could help them. The cool access calculator, so there's a really nice estimator there where you can put in how much storage you've got, how much of your storage you estimate to be cool, how much you estimate to be pulled back across a month, and then it will give you an indicative idea of savings. There's a nice little map there. There's the link to the product team's YouTube channel. There's a capacity manager logic application, which was written by one of the TMEs, the marketing engineers. And there's also a nice bit of PowerShell script which you can deploy and run, which produces nice HTML reports to see what your state's like. So quite a useful site with a few tools there to utilize. And also there's the What's New page. Most of the product teams have What's New pages. So, you can check out the Azure NetApp Files What's New page, and it will show you there basically recent service announcements, what's been released, a few details, and obviously URLs to the various updates for you to use. Cool. Any questions? I'd like to try to do a demo. I'm conscious of time, but are we okay for time?
I think we're good, Anthony, if you want to forge ahead.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so wish me luck. I'm just going to try and swap screens now, so give me a second. Okay. So what I have done, as I mentioned, I think at the beginning, I've created a lab which can be utilized. It's on my GitHub repo. I will share the link. I'll drop that in the chat for people, if that's okay.
By all means.
There's a link there to this lab. It's quite straightforward. There are some guidelines here about it. Anybody who's familiar with Terraform will probably find it quite straightforward. Please don't hate me. I'm not a coder. My coding skills, I'm not the most elegant of writing, but it works. So it'll get you to the point where you have a lab built where you can then go and do some playing around in testing. So like I said, that's all in here. There's a little image just quickly what the lab is. The lab is basically utilizes 2 regions. You can change the regions, and I'll show you that in a minute. It utilizes Azure Key Vault for authentication for the Linux virtual machine that it builds. I'm not using SSH because that would be ridiculously complex, so it's just password authentication. Again, security junkies, please don't hate me, but this is a lab. And there's various network infrastructure, so there's VNets, subnets, and then peering, so then you can have a bit of a play with it and various other things. So I mentioned the ability to edit the code. So in here, in the repository, there's this terraform.tf-vars file. I've tried to put in as much as possible. For instance, if you wanted to change the regions, I can't, for instance, as part of my subscription, use the US regions. I can only use certain UK and European regions. So if you wanted to use different regions, you could do there. You can just change some of the tags. And I've tried to make it as modular as informative. So if you wanted to adjust the way the networking is laid out, if you wanted to adjust the type of virtual machine you're using, the version of the operating system, if you wanted to utilize, different service tiers, for instance, in ANF, simply edit that TFVARS file, and that would build everything for you. That's the only file you should need to edit. Okay. Now, if I just then dive into Azure, hopefully we're all relatively familiar with Azure. As I said, I've pre-created some of this, so I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with a TV program in the United Kingdom called Blue Peter. They always use a phrase. It's a kids show where they kind of build stuff and make stuff. Here's one I created earlier. So I've actually deployed that code as an example for you here. And as you can see, I've called it Lab Boston, and so the resource groups. And you'll see what it's built out in here. It's built an ANF account, compatible volumes. There's a network card there because Azure NetApp Files is a network attached storage service, and it creates that card as part of the volume creation. There's also a key vault, NSGs, various other things in here, managed disks, VNets, machines, etc. So that's what it would build for you. Please feel free to have a play with it. I've tested it so many times, it works. Okay. One thing I should mention, what I did note the other day, there's been an upgrade. So the Terraform, I'm not using Terraform version 4. I'm using this version of the resource provider. Now, the reason I'm using a version 3 is when they introduce version 4, there's a requirement which you'll need to come down here into the provider and specify the sub ID. Now, the reason I haven't done that is because that would have meant I would have had to expose my sub ID, and I didn't really want to do that. And it just makes it nice and easy. I'm not sure why they've done that. It's just something that HashiCorp did recently. So if you want to change the Azure RM provider, just, you can update that here. This random provider, by the way, is building out the naming conventions. So if you see here on the end of every name, there's this random 4-character string. I did this for people who want multiple people using a single subscription, for instance. So that's just there as just to give it uniqueness. So hopefully that's giving you a quick overview of what I've done in the lab and shared for you guys. And there are, there's various instructions here, and hopefully anybody who's familiar with Terraform would find this quite straightforward. Cool. So let's have a quick look at Azure NetApp Files. So I'm going to focus on this particular Azure NetApp Files account here. So if you remember, the account level is where you set the region. So this one is in North Europe. North Europe is actually in Dublin, in Ireland. By the way, is the screen big enough, by the way? Is it visible? I'm just conscious I'm working on quite a small screen.
I think it's okay.
Yeah, okay. So this is an Azure NetApp Files account, and at the level where we are here, under settings, Microsoft handily put this little quota guide in for you. So there are quotas which you can ask by support request to be uplifted. The one I think to be conscious of is the maximum regional capacity quota in a subscription is 25 terabytes. That is a soft limit. Okay, it's a soft limit there purely for the Microsoft capacity teams to manage capacities in the region. It's a simple support request to Microsoft, say, hey, can I have 100 terabytes or however much you need? But that's just one to take note of. Azure Advisor integration. So there's various things in Azure Advisor. Luckily, I've got nothing there advisories at the minute, but quite useful. Again, to possibly drive down on the costs. At the account level is also where you set the Active Directory configuration string should you need that. Not all customers do, because some are using it for NFS, some are using it for both. But if you want to integrate with Active Directory, you need to configure this string. You simply set your DNS, the usual stuff, DNS, DNS names, the SMB prefix. So this prefix here is a 3-character string which gets appended to the beginning of the name of the volumes, and I'll show you that in a minute. You can't choose the volume name. It's because it's a managed service by Microsoft. That's all dictated as part of the service, but you can set the first few characters to give you some sort of identifier. Obviously, things like organizational unit, usernames, if you've got Kerberos, you can use Kerberos, set the AD site names. That's all done in there. It's very simple. And I think over, say, Azure files, much, much easier to work with. If you've worked with Azure files and integrating that in Active Directory, it's a bit clunky. You've got to do a load of PowerShell scripting. It's not ideal. And also, Azure files has a public endpoint. Azure NetApp files has no public endpoint. It's a private service that only exists within your VNet. That could be good, it could be bad, but there is no public endpoint for ANF, which kind of makes it, well, is more secure. With Azure files, you have to go down locking down those public endpoints, making sure your security is in place. Encryption as well. So I mentioned encryption earlier. So you have the option to use Microsoft managed keys or Microsoft managed keys. Microsoft managed keys managed by Microsoft for you. If you have a requirement to use your own key, then you can opt to use custom managed keys, and then you utilize Azure Key Vault. You can enable automatic key rotation, and you can even have the option should you wish to rekey here as well. Mostly popular in large financial organizations where they have that ability, in some government organizations. Onto the storage service itself. I have a capacity pool here. As you see, this capacity pool has 2 terabytes to use, and it's at the standard service tier, and I'm using Auto QoS. Now, for instance, say, all of a sudden I might need more storage. I simply go to resize and say, actually, now I need 4 terabytes. Click OK. A couple of seconds, there we go. It's as simple as that. I've now got 4 terabytes of storage I can use in my capacity pool. Now, with my volumes, if I go down to the volume layer, I've got a load of volumes created in here for various things. As you can see, I've got NFS, I've got SMB, I've got dual protocol volumes. Now, for instance, this particular volume here is 200 gigabytes. If I wanted to resize that volume, again, I simply come in here. Now, it's telling me the quota that I have available in that capacity pool, which I've just upped to 4 terabytes. So I can choose the number there and put in however much I need. And this is an auto QoS pool, so it will automatically then increase the throughput. If it was a manual one, it would be giving me options to set the throughput as well. If you see here, this is an SMB volume. So this is the mount path. So this is the path you would take and present to your host. And at the beginning of that, you see the ANF. That's that 3-character string I showed you in the Active Directory connection. So this is actually what's called a storage virtual machine, which is virtualized machine, running on tap. And obviously the domain name, which I've given it as part of my Active Directory configuration string. The final part of the UNC path here is the volume name or share name. But if you look in the code in the back end, if you're looking in the, for instance, what you're looking for, it's called the creation token. So this is what's called the creation token. You've got things here like maximum number of files. You can see the quota you've got, the throughput you've got available as well. Now, one of the great things about ANF, if I just go back to the account level, is it's built on NetApp's technology. And you can implement snapshot policies. So these snapshot policies essentially can be automated to take snapshots of the volumes at intervals, hourly, daily, weekly, monthly intervals. So you've got point in time recovery, literally snapshots you can recover to points in time. And hey, we all remember what happened recently with the CrowdStrike issue. Having the ability to essentially rewind the clock to a known good working state is massively important. And these snapshots are very efficient. The snapshots themselves live in the volumes. They take usually 5, 10, maybe 15% of an overhead on the volume for the capacity for the snapshot, because they're essentially pointers to blocks on the disk. That's what makes them very efficient, and that's one of NetApp's USPs. So that snapshotting capability is very, very powerful. A lot of customers use it to dev test scenarios because you can take a snapshot, you can then clone a volume from that snapshot. You can recover a volume as well. The backup side of it, so there's a backup vault for ANF. As I mentioned earlier, you can set backups. If I go into the backup vault here, you can see I've got 1 volume attached. That's that volume I was talking to you about in a minute. I can go and assign more volumes as well. Now, if I hop back to that volume itself, come in here, and if I drill down to the backup side, There we go. So you can see all the backups I've got available to me should I need to restore. These backups are living on ZR storage, but if I needed the option to, I have the option to restore to a new volume, or I can actually restore individual files. And again, this is all part of the service. It's not part of the Azure Backup Center, which kind of does great with a few people, me included. But you have the ability in here to recover files, relatively quickly. A super performance. So there's a question in the chat. If ANF has no public endpoint, what would be the best way to import data from external data sources into ANF? Great question. So there are numerous tools out there. There's the Azure Storage Migration Program, which I think is still running, where Microsoft have some vendors, Cirrus, Comprise, data, was it a Tempo? There's a few third-party storage vendors, third-party migration vendors, so software you can license to use. Now, I would need to double check this. I do know that Microsoft had a program running, the Azure Storage Migration Program, where depending on the amount of data you were looking to move into Azure, I think those tool sets were included free of charge. I would need to check that. However, and this is interesting because I was doing a talk at a conference in Las Vegas a week or so ago with a customer that had actually, it was telling their story. It sounds daft to say it, but the most common tool sets used are for SMB, Robocopy, and for NFS, rsync, because heck, they're free, they're tried and tested, people understand them. With things like Robocopy, you can hyper-thread it, so you can multi-thread it, you can QoS it, you can manage it quite well. Now, granted, that's not ideal, because if you're moving data across the wire, it can be very, very time-consuming. For a heavy lift of ANF of data into ANF, annoyingly, Azure Databox doesn't support Azure NetApp files as a storage target. I've heard of methods as a double hop using Databox. So if you have a massive amount of data you need to move out of a data center into Azure, excuse me, Databox to move the data to Azure files, and then a double hop into Azure NetApp files. Conscious of the permissions and everything else, and there's quite a bit of engagement there. So hopefully that's useful. Hopefully I've answered your question. Cool. Other things to note here, if I just go down to, so this is the storage layer, we've got backups, user group quotas, you can come in here, you can add quotas, you have the option for default user quota, which then affects everybody in the volume. However, you can create an individual quota, which will override that. That could be less than the default, more than the default. And obviously you can set your quota limits and the sizing, so whatever you need here. Quite useful if you use unstructured user data, etc. Monitoring, it's an Azure service, right? So you can use Azure metrics and monitor metrics here. So there are metrics you can put in place. They're Azure metrics, okay? So they're spat out every 5 minutes. And in storage world, that's a lifetime. Not ideal for most people, but it is what it is. That's all there is there, but you can use them. One thing I haven't really highlighted or mentioned probably is, because this is a resource managed service, it's API driven. You can control it via REST API. So tools such as Terraform, ARM, Bicep, etc. You can I have customers that have this integrated into their DevOps pipelines, where they manage that, they run a pipeline overnight which does various tasks, batch processing, it captures snapshots, the backups included. They can do some scaling up, some scaling down, all done through automation. There is that logic application I mentioned earlier, which is a capacity manager, which will monitor ANF capacity and then scale as needed as capacity grows. So that's important to point out. So, you can do this all via ClickOps in the portal, or you can use, coding, infrastructure as code methods as well, like I've done with Terraform by building the lab itself. The replication, I mentioned replication technologies. You're seeing here, this volume is actually being replicated. You can see the total progress of replication, the interval that's been set. Again, some of the metrics are exposed here. Very straightforward to set up. And the snapshots, You can see here that these are the snapshots. This volume is using the snapshot policy I showed you earlier. So it's capturing daily, hourly, daily, weekly, monthly snapshots. And the snapshots will reside in here. As I said, they live in the volume themselves. If, God forbid, oh my God, there's a CrowdStrike issue again. I can come in here and say, I can restore this snapshot to a new volume. I can restore individual files from within the volume, or I can just revert the volume back to this snapshot point in time. So extremely powerful, especially in a BCDR scenario, if God forbid you needed to recover.
Anthony, does
yeah.
the policy govern this also say how long to retain each backup?
Yes, there is the retention on the backup. Let me just go back up to here. Pretty sure. Hello, apologies. My Teams crashed. Hi, can you hear me?
Oh, good. Welcome back.
Sorry, yeah, Teams crashed. So just love it. Okay, let me just get back to where we were. So let's share this. Hopefully you can see that. So yeah, so you can't necessarily keep for a certain period of time, but what you can say is how many you want to keep. So keep 7 dailies, keep 7 weeklies, keep monthlies, but then obviously, and there is a finite amount. It's several years it works out to be essentially, but you don't sort of say keep for a period of years. What customers are doing for long-term retention are offloading snapshots into, say, blob storage after the fact if they need to retain them longer.
Very helpful. Makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Cool. So I've taken up a lot of your time. Bit of a whistle-stop tour. Hopefully it's been useful. I'm very happy now to field any questions. But what I would like to do is just finish off I'll present the slide again, if that's okay. Back to here. So yeah, the summary really. ANF is a very simple service to work with. We use the phrase volume as a service. You don't need to be a storage expert. You can simply consume storage on demand. I do a lot of work with teams who are developers, they're DBAs, they don't want to be managing storage. So this gives them the ability to do that without having to badger the storage team to actually get them to deliver what they need. The efficiencies, again, cloud economics, by right sizing for performance, the natural byproduct is cost optimization. And ANF, the original tagline for Azure NetApp Files was migrate the unmigratable. It was the ability to migrate workloads that historically in a data center required that high performance, low latency into Azure. And before ANF, you would have needed to probably stand up scale file cluster or NFS cluster, which was big expensive machines using lots of very expensive managed disks, and it wasn't delivering the performance, and it was way too expensive. So I think the key summary there is simplicity, efficiency, cost, and the mobility to move the solution. There's a couple of more things. Go and have a play with it. It's a very easy service to interact with. Hopefully the little lab that I've produced you can use to test with and get a bit more experience. And then essentially thank you. I appreciate the time giving me the time to speak to the user group. It's a real privilege, and please reach out and connect with me. I'm on Twitter. I've recently pushed a new blog site out. My old one was mashfords.com. I've decommissioned that because it was on WordPress. It was getting a bit clunky, so I'm using GitHub Pages now. So azuretechlab.com, you can find me there, and also my GitHub repo is Anthony Mashford. So and scan the QR code if you want to connect, please. So thank you very much for listening.
This has been really excellent, Anthony, very informative. Does anybody have any final questions for Anthony? Okay, well, I'll take it that your presentation was so clear and you answered several questions on the fly. So I thank you, Anthony, and thank you everybody for joining. We'll see some of you at the Boston Code Camp and some of you at the training day that we're planning for November and December, and at future Boston Azure events. We'll let Anthony go to turn in now. It's a bit late for him. It's a little after midnight, I think, right?
Yeah, 12:15. Yeah, it's not too late. Like I said, I'm a night owl. It doesn't bother me too much. But
very good.
Cool.
Excellent. We'll be in touch on the podcast, Anthony.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, and thank you. Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to speak. Enjoyed it.
Absolutely appreciate it. It's very engaging. Really appreciate it. You have a good night.
Andrew,
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks.
You're welcome.